and thank you everybody for tuning in this evening. I'd say we've got a really good, well-rounded evening of speakers, all looking into gaming in slightly different ways, using different approaches, offering different perspectives, and that's great to see. I'm just going to ignore the chat, no offense, whilst I speak, but do use it, and I guess we can use it for questions and stuff at the end. Now, my focus is not on the game Football Manager itself per se, but rather the ways in which people interact with their kind of favourite games. And I don't simply mean the ways in which a game might be played, but the ways in which a particular game might become intertwined within the everyday lived experience of a particular gamer. And in this case, with a focus on the later life course, the older gamer. So the plan for these next 20 minutes or so, I'll start with a brief overview of the background context to this study. I'll chat briefly about the importance of research on aging and engaging with culture, and I'll give some details about the larger project that this case study has emerged from. I'll try and do that nice and quick because the most interesting part of this talk will hopefully be Matt, who's the case study participant, and his relationship with the game Football Manager. Now, I'm assuming that probably everybody at this particular conference will be aware of what Football Manager is. It's a football simulation game. But unlike the likes of FIFA and PES or eFootball as it is now, you don't take direct control of the players, at least not in the same way. So you play the role of a manager, set up your team, instructions, tactics and whatnot, and then watch how that plays out from the sidelines. So aesthetically, it's perhaps not in the same league as other football sims, but it's not meant to be, right? The value of Football Manager is in the depth of its gameplay. It prides itself on having an enormous database of players and leagues, and importantly, for what we'll be chatting about in a little while, it's very customizable, as many games are, I suppose, and that's an important point to remember as we move on. Now, the importance of research on aging. So this is proper gerontology. There are a few reasons why it's important to conduct research on the aging process and to speak to people about the experience of growing older. And perhaps most obviously, this older demographic is growing year on year due to the global trends of population aging. It's expected that by 2050, the world will have an over 60 population of more than 2 billion, including over 25 million centenarians. And this will be a cohort which, for the first time in human history, will outnumber the world's younger demographics. So Japan actually offers one of the most vivid examples of the impacts of population aging, hence why I've chosen to show you this particular image. So up until the first panel here, the Japanese over 75 population hovered pretty stably throughout the history of the country, about 1 to 1.3%. But see how the shape of Japan's population has transformed from a pyramid in 1965 there, with a big young base, to a predicted inverted pyramid in 2065, in just a century. So it's predicted that come 2065, a quarter of the country's entire population will be aged 75 or older. Now, the UK is not quite on the same scale as Japan. However, it is still significant. By 2050, it's been predicted that nearly a quarter of the UK's population will be over 65 years of age. So these trends are important. As Leeson, who's a gerontologist, has pointed out, and I quote, he says, growing old in societies dominated demographically by young people is fundamentally different from growing old in societies dominated demographically by older people. And as Harrington and Bealby, who are media and communications scholars, suggest, they say that as normative adult life destabilizes, it's cultural objects that are increasingly providing a reference point for navigating the trajectory through adulthood and later life. So we need a better understanding of living in and with older societies, and particularly how older people use culture in navigating those later life stages. Now, this is Matt. Matt's being used here as an example case study, and we'll work down this list on the screen in just a moment because it's important that we understand some background context of Matt as an individual. However, first, it's also important to acknowledge that this research with Matt, he's just one from a much larger research project which looked into sports fandom and identity in later life. So for this, I interviewed 35 people using in-depth, semi-structured interviews. The average age of my sample was 72.5 years old, with the age range 54 to 88, a third female, two-thirds male. I defined older as those belonging to what's known in gerontology as the third and fourth life ages. So in shorthand, I mean that those who have left full-time employment. So it's out of a big data set that the theory I'll be using comes. And I argue ultimately that Matt's gaming can be viewed as belonging to, or being an expression of, or an extension of his wider football fandom. Now, Matt himself, Matt's obviously a pseudonym. He's a white male, 69 years old, born and raised in Grimsby, worked in Grimsby, currently lives in Grimsby. He's never left Northeast Lincolnshire, actually. He was a postman for the Royal Mail throughout his whole career, and has now been fully retired for 4 years. Fan interests: he's a football fan, a lifelong Manchester City fan, also a Grimsby Town fan, his local team. He's a citizen, which means that's like the Man City kind of membership scheme. Travels to watch matches at the Etihad whenever he can. Gaming interest is Football Manager. That's basically the only game he plays. He took it up 8 or 9 years ago, so after he turned 60. He doesn't like FIFA or other console games because he feels as though he doesn't have the dexterity for it, for holding the controllers. So the reason that Matt became interested in gaming with Football Manager is, I'm suggesting, due, at least in part, to his relationship with his main Manchester City fan Text. Now, there's a lot of underlying kind of psychoanalytic theory here. That's the approach that I used. And I spent an entire thesis trying to develop it. I just don't have time to go into it in all that much detail. So I'm going to give you the kind of truncated version. So firstly, fandom is highly idiosyncratic. You know, it's a very individual, personal thing, the relationship that one has with their favorite fan object. There are debates within fan studies as to whether fandom is a social phenomenon or a personal experience. And I'm very much an advocate of the latter, that whilst fan groups can obviously be social, it's the immediate personal, emotional relationship with an object that binds us to a particular fandom. Secondly, textual engagement is not a passive thing. We are active readers of texts. And also, not everybody reads texts in the same ways. So, for example, one of the other participants in my larger study was a person called Ross. Ross is 61. He also lives in Grimsby. He was also born, brought up and worked in Grimsby, and is also a Manchester City and Grimsby Town fan, just like Matt. Now, the fortunes of Manchester City, since being taken over by the Abu Dhabi Group in 2008, it's been transformed. They're now one of the leading clubs in the country. They've enjoyed huge success. Ross loves this. He thinks it's that the takeover has propelled City to their rightful place among the footballing elite. Matt, on the other hand, is very lukewarm about the upturn in City's fortunes, which might seem initially to kind of counteract common sense, but he doesn't like the fact that City are now expected to win every game they play. He says it takes away from the feeling of victory when they do win. Kind of the opposite issue of Sunderland, isn't it? Sorry, it's a part of Matt's personality, I couldn't help it, that he likes the underdog. Okay, so it's inbuilt within Matt that he loves an underdog. This became very clear during our conversations. Even his Man City kind of fan origin story, if you like, was based on his feeling sorry for Manchester City. As a child, he saw all of the coverage of the Munich air disaster. That's when Manchester United's squad was decimated when their plane crashed coming back from a European Cup fixture. And he felt bad that City were being completely ignored. And throughout his life, City have been the poor relation when compared to United, forever looking up at their intercity rivals. And Grimsby, similarly, have never been much more than an underdog team for large parts of their history. And particularly during the time when Matt started supporting the club in the late 1960s and 1970s, they were going through one of their least successful periods, like bumbling around at the bottom of the football pyramid. So when suddenly, in a relative blink of an eye, City became this great club, attracting the best players and managers from around the world, winning titles, challenging for trophies, it caused a discomfort, a kind of disconnect between Matt and his object of fandom. He no longer sees this underdog quality in City anymore. However, about 8 years ago, his son introduced him to Football Manager, which I think was very helpful for Matt and his football fandom. Now, Matt could pretend to be any of the very best teams in the world on the game. He could manage Man City, his favourite team, though he never does. As he says, I started off as Everton this year because I was Everton last year. I usually go with teams who are in the Europa League. He only ever chooses teams who are sort of ranked underneath other more successful sides. And when we spoke, he'd started managing AFC Bournemouth, one of the smallest sides to have ever featured in the Premier League. And certainly an underdog team. Interestingly, he actually quite likes the way that the current Man City team play. He just doesn't like the fact that they're no longer underdogs. As he says here, I tried doing Man City manager Pep Guardiola's tactics with teams other than City, but it didn't work, so I had to start a new game. So what I'm arguing is that in the absence of a particular essence of his fandom of Manchester City, that underdog aspect that Matt saw as being synonymous with the club throughout his life until about a decade ago, he's found another object through which he can express that aspect of his football fandom. That's why games like Football Manager are what I call fluid cultural objects. Users can take advantage of the customizable aspects of these games and manipulate them in a way which fits in with their wider fanish interests. There's a piece of artwork called there's a picture of it at the bottom there. It's called Us by Jennifer Rebel. It's a glass-blown newborn baby. So in the gallery, the sculpture is passed around the visitors. The idea being that the work is only ever complete once the viewer and the sculpture are engaged together. And that's the perfect metaphor for the kind of cultural object that Football Manager and other football sims are. The games as texts are effectively semi-empty vessels which are only ever completed once we project our own senses of self onto them. Now, Football Manager and everyday fandom. So building on this idea that the Football Manager game does not exist in isolation as a game, it's not felt or played as a standalone kind of cultural unit. Rather, it's experienced within the realm of the everyday lived experience of being a football fan. So these bits from social media, well, the one on the left just made me laugh, but the tweet here from Football Manager Memes from the summer of 2021, last year, when the men's Euros were taking place, speaks to how people blend the real life and the game. The idea that people will be watching the Euros, seeing the success of Dumfries, and thinking how they might be able to work him into their latest save on Football Manager. Matt is exactly the same in this regard as these quotes show. I don't go anywhere I don't know the players. Matt means he'll only manage teams in the game where he knows something about the real life players. There's the assumption that the game is like a kind of perfect representation of the qualities of real life players, rather than relying on the game's kind of inbuilt rating and scouting system. Matt relies on his own knowledge of real life players, even though there might be this kind of disconnect between his own ratings and the game's. This second quote. I went on Everton this year and I realised what a mess their transfer window was, because I couldn't get my players in. There's that many similar sort of players and no strikers. Obviously it's mirroring real life. And I thought, how does a real life manager do it? Matt's better understanding the real life Premier League through his gaming experience. Again, as if the gaming experience is kind of like as good as real life. This last quote is particularly interesting. That's where I get mixed up sometimes, because I think, is he good on Football Manager or is he good in real life? Matt sometimes forgets where Football Manager ends and the real Premier League begins, because he's constantly engaging with his fan object through the prism of Football Manager. And it works both ways. He says, I won't sign any Man United players. I mean, it's bloody crazy. I just won't. His so-called kind of like real life fandom crosses into his Football Manager gameplay. Obviously, a real life Football Manager wouldn't be so stubborn as to blacklist an entire club, but this quirk of Matt's fandom impacts how he plays. The so-called real and the gameplay are intimately intertwined. Now, before we move on to the last slide, it's very important to note that this is non-pejorative gameplay, right? It's completely normal to interact with a game in this way. And there's a danger when we talk about these kinds of sports fan gamer interactions between like the real and the imaginary, when we're talking about that blending of the real and the digital and the imagined, that our participants come across as like crazy, so in some way. but we must not pathologize fans and gamers. This is simply healthy cultural play. Now, finally, I don't really have time to go into this, but I couldn't talk about later life gaming and accessibility. I couldn't talk about later life gaming without mentioning accessibility. It should be a presentation in itself, really. But I just wanted to briefly raise it as being a real issue for older gamers. So gaming could be a great tool to use in later life care, for example, particularly so in the coming decades when, the first kind of digital native generations reach later life. It's not that far away now. But there are barriers to gaming for older generations. So among my participants, Matt was, relatively speaking, pretty healthy. He had a few mobility issues. He had some poor knees, which meant he couldn't stand for long periods of time. But working as a postman had obviously kept him fairly fit throughout his life, and he walks his dogs now every day. But even he suggested, if you remember at the beginning, that he didn't feel he had the dexterity for playing games on consoles. Many of my other participants, even though they'd be classed as physiologically healthy for their age, would have difficulty playing games. This table on the left, which I don't expect you to read, by the way. This is a list of my participants in age order, youngest at the top, oldest at the bottom, with the colours representing those who have had significant diagnosed life-altering or life-limiting illnesses or ailments. Now, given the realities of later life health, it's sometimes difficult to avoid the frail old person stereotype. In fact, actually, lots of later life gaming research unwittingly perpetuates this view. There have already been some promising studies on the use of Nintendo Wii's in care homes, improving physiology, improving balance, that kind of thing. But these types of studies are so often based on how games can be used as a therapeutic tool for rehabilitation, rather than focusing on older people as gamers in their own right. So as my last bullet point says, we should, on the one hand, appreciate that to be kind of, quote, healthy in later life means something different to being healthy as a 30-year-old. Designers should take this into account. However, gaming in later life should not be relegated to just simply being a therapeutic tool. Even if there are benefits, older people can be gamers in their own right too. So yeah, thank you very much. If you've got any questions, then feel free to ask.